What is up, assholes, and anyone else out there who might have clicked onto this video expecting... I don't know what people are going to expect when they see this. Welcome to another Gwent-related video, another discussion video, or me monologuing about something and then in hopes of sparking up some conversation. So today I have decided to finally do a video on what may be my hottest take in Gwent. I don't know. It's just, in my head, it does feel like the most controversial one. And there's no reason to beat around the bush. It's already in the title and thumbnail. Was Syndicate a mistake? Now, before we get into why I personally think that yes, maybe it was, and, you know, there's going to be a lot of my opinions. I do have some statistics, some historical factoids, you know, to explain why I feel this way. This is obviously not objectively true, necessarily. But before we get into it, I do want to preface that this video is not made out of hate. I did not just get wrecked by a Syndicate deck, and I'm now so tilted that I'm thinking the entire faction was a mistake. This video is not meant to give any hate to the faction itself, the people who designed it, or the people who enjoy playing it. Far from it. I mean, there is a lot to like about Syndicate. You know, clearly, it doesn't take a lot of detective work to deduce that it's my least played faction. I never bothered to really take an interest, get invested, really learn how to play the faction. And also, Syndicate videos have always been underperforming significantly, so like I didn't have that incentive. There's been no incentive for me to get into it, but I can definitely see why people gravitate towards the faction. You know, there's a lot to appreciate, a lot of cool archetypes. I think Firesworn is really cool. You know, I used to say it was one of the most well-designed archetypes in the game, and you know, that probably still holds true. I like Self-Poison. I like Bounty. I don't like playing against it, but I do really like what they've done with the archetype now that it is actually seeing some play. I like the gang stuff. I like Crimes, Intimidate, Horde with the Tide Cloaks. There is a lot to like about the faction. It's very unique. It's got, you know, its own set of mechanics. And yeah, like it's not for me, but I definitely see how people would like this faction, would like to play it. And like I have nothing against the faction itself. I really don't. I think in a different universe, in a different timeline, this faction could exist in the game as it is, and I would not even feel in the slightest inclined to make this video. But this is not that timeline. Now, do I feel like, is Syndicate the reason Gwent is dying? No. Far from it. There are so many other factors, so many bigger factors. Like, if Syndicate even actually played a part in that, it's such a minuscule part that it's... forget about it. What's happening with Gwent and Gwentfinity and all of that, I don't really think Syndicate had anything to do with it. But yeah, okay, so that's out of the way. Like, I like the faction. I think it's cool. Personally, it's not for me. I don't really play it a lot. But there's a lot to appreciate. And if you like Syndicate, if you enjoy playing it, that's awesome. That's great. You know, that's why they made it. So some people would want to play it, right? But with that out of the way, let's get into it. Why I think Syndicate was maybe a mistake. We're going to start with the release of Gwent Homecoming in October 2018. The game had gone I don't know, like half a year, maybe a little bit more, without anything new being added, anything being done, because the game went into maintenance mode, because they were planning to rework the whole thing. People could still play it, you know, the final open beta version of it, but the game had, you know, just taken a wrong path, and they were now reworking the whole thing. October 2018 rolls around. Gwent Homecoming is released, and this is also the official release of Gwent out of beta. It's now an officially launched game. Great. I was thrilled to have Gwent back on the menu. I was enjoying it shortly after I started making content. It was it was fun, but even at the time, but especially now looking back, it is clear to see that things were really, really rough. They had introduced a lot of new mechanics, like very fundamental mechanics, like the provision system, like order abilities. That was brand new. Artifacts as a third card type was brand new. Just a lot of new things. And like there were so many issues with some of these new mechanics, but also with just general design. Like faction identity was sorely lacking. Archetypes were very like half-assed. Like pretty much no archetypes were like fully fleshed out. Because I think they were going for like this thing where you like an archetype was like half a deck, so you combined two archetypes. And I was into the concept of that, and I still, can definitely appreciate some of the ideas behind it, but clearly it didn't work. Neutral cards were reigning supreme, just like now. Not much has changed. But not much has changed in that regard, but a lot has changed in terms of, card design becoming more interesting. And yeah, they just made so many decisions that they later have gone back to and just reverted a lot of them. So it feels very obvious for an outsider like me looking back. I've been following the game very closely for many, many years. I've had my opinions here and there. But looking back, like, it just really seems more and more obvious that they did not have a clear vision. They did not have a plan. Because it seemed like just a lot of things were thrown at the wall. A lot of it didn't stick. And they had to redo it. And yeah, like just a few quick examples. Artifacts were incredibly poorly designed. Artifact removal was super binary. Like one of the most toxic interactions in the game's history, in my opinion. They had reduced the overall power level of cards drastically, just to, I guess, make the math simpler. And I think they even said that we don't need the bigger numbers because we have the provision system to help us balance, so like this works. And then now they have like doubled, if not more than doubled, the overall power level of cards across the board, because that allows for more interesting design and easier balancing. And that's just so many things that they've gone back on. Things that they defended at first, and then suddenly, like several months later usually, it just like snapped. Like, okay, you know what? We realize this is an issue. We're gonna fix it. And then it's usually like a half-assed fix. And we have to wait a few more months. And then maybe an actual fix comes around. So, yeah. And then we got our first expansion in March 2019. I believe it was March, yeah. Crimson Curse, which added a few more half-assed archetypes into the game. Some good ones. Assimilate, which I know now has a bad reputation, but it used to be really fun. Skellige got Self-Wound, a personal favorite of mine, for many, many years now. But, it didn't do much to fix the half-baked archetypes that already existed. They just added more. And the game was just in a really rough state. And then second expansion came around, Novigrad, and we just got a 6th faction. Now, a lot of people were excited about a new faction. I was excited about it. But again, it's the power of hindsight. Looking back, it's very clear that they did not have the resources to manage a 6th faction, you know? Just looking at the state of the game, looking at the state of each of the 5 existing factions, they needed so much more work. But instead, they spent an entire expansion. And this means we waited 3 months and then got an expansion that didn't help the existing factions. Then we had to wait 3 more months to get an expansion that actually affected them. The dual faction cards, they barely count. But from here on out, each expansion had 1/6 of it focus on Syndicate, an additional faction. So, like, Syndicate was introduced at a very bad time. But I get it. If you're going to introduce a 6th faction, you want to do it early, right? Because the later you do it, the more cards you have to put into it for it to just be equal. So I get the idea of introducing it early. But Gwent was not ready. And the dev team did not seem ready to have a 6th faction on their plate. And especially one that introduced so many new mechanics that proved to be what I perceived as a development nightmare for many, many months, if not years to come. So that's the essence of why I think Syndicate might have just been a mistake. It's not anything wrong with the faction itself. It's just that I don't think the game or the development team I don't think they could afford, really, to add an extra faction to the game. The resources weren't there. And then, the game went forward. Syndicate was definitely problematic in a lot of ways. Because the coin mechanic and the carryover that came with it, the way fee worked, and just the way it just seemed like they needed to be balanced in like a different way, and that was difficult for them to figure out. So I just feel like, at least for the first few months, if not maybe like a year, probably longer than that, like Syndicate just added an extra level of complication to Gwent's development. But this was something that had to be constantly addressed alongside the other 5 factions, just to, keep things going. We have 6 factions now. They all need to be tweaked and buffed and expanded upon equally. And of course they do. But when you're already struggling with 5 factions, and you're struggling with faction identity, you're struggling with filling out the archetypes, and you're struggling with balancing them, having a 6th one just does not help. Like yes, it added so many interesting concepts to the game, so many fun concepts, and I know there are people who love Syndicate. Obviously, there are people who have Syndicate as their favorite faction, and that's great. Like, I'm glad you enjoy it. I really am. I wish I enjoyed it as much as you do. But it's just, I think the game overall would have been better off without it, simply because realistically there was no room for it. And Syndicate, we'll be getting into some statistics soon. I'll be showing you some stats. Syndicate has had a history of either being infuriatingly OP and just ruining the meta, just conquering the meta, and then suddenly it becomes like practically non-existent for a few months because they just have to heavily nerf it. And often I feel like they're carried by maybe very specific cards. and then they have to hit those cards with nerfs, and then the whole faction is just like, oh wait, this faction actually doesn't really work without anything broken to carry it. And so, again, just taking it back to the whole development nightmare thing. Like, Syndicate has... Like, it must have cost so much time and resources for the development team that I feel should have been spent on just, you know, expanding upon the existing factions, filling out the archetypes, creating more faction diversity, expanding upon faction identity, and even just overall things like marketing the game better, you know? There's just... Like, Syndicate, there's so much to appreciate about the faction, but it being the 6th faction, here's the thing. A lot of these issues that have happened with Syndicate, they have happened with other factions. Like, pretty much everything. I can guarantee you, more or less everything that has been problematic about Syndicate has been problematic about at least one other faction at some point. But Syndicate being the 6th faction, Syndicate being the one extra faction that was added on later, it makes it the target of this video, right? If Syndicate was one of the original 5 and Skellige was added as the 6th one, then Skellige would have been a problem. Not a problem, but, you know, Skellige would have been potentially a mistake. So, like, this really isn't about my feelings about the faction itself. I'm just trying to hammer that point home. Like, I have no reason to hate on this faction more than any other. Actually, less so than some others at the moment, but, you know, it being that extra faction, it being the 6th one, it automatically makes it the one that the game couldn't afford. And that's just... It's sad to say it, and maybe it's controversial. I'd love to hear your opinions on what I'm saying here. But I just really want to hammer home the fact that I am not trying to hate on Syndicate as a faction. It's just... Gwent couldn't afford it. Which I guess is ironic because it has all the coin stuff. Not being able to afford it. It's too expensive. It's just... Gwent... Like, at the time Gwent was released, with Gwent Homecoming, it had already lost so much traction. So many of the big content creators had left, which allowed smaller ones, like new ones like me, to actually get a grip in the community, which, you know, I do appreciate. But, you know, I lost a lot of my favorite content creators for Gwent, and like, you could say Gwent Homecoming, like Gwent on its official release, was dead on arrival. You know, lately I've been saying as a joke, whenever people say Gwent is dead or Gwent is dying, I just say, dude, Gwent has been dead for 5 years. Get over it. What's already dead cannot die again. And, you know, Gwent has been in severe need of help since day one. At least since day one of the official release. And, you know, it's like if you have 5 kids and you are really struggling to feed them all, clothe them all, give them all access to, you know, free time activities, stuff like that. You're struggling to have time for them all. Do not have a 6th baby. It's that simple. I'm about to have my first baby, and that, you know, I mean, I can't imagine ever having 6, but, you know, I'm going to have my first. I'm going to make sure that he is set up nicely and that I know I have time for a second one before I have a second one. You know, so that's that. Okay, but let's get into some statistics. I've gathered up some stats, so let's take a look at those. Alright, as you can see in front of you right now, there are a bunch of graphs. I will quickly explain what they are, what they mean. And I'll be showing you a few slides here, so just stay with me. I'll try to not get too technical I don't think I could get too technical even if I tried, because I'm not that smart. Apologies for the low resolution on the top left one. I don't know what that is. But these are all statistics taken from gwentdata.com, I believe it's called. We can go look at play rate and win rate for all the factions each season, dating back to, I believe, October 2020 was the earliest one I could read. I'll not be showing you all the way back to then, but I'll be talking about some trends going back there. So on the top left, we do have March 2023. And the way these work, each faction has two columns. The left column is the play rate of the faction, and the right one is the play rate for people who had that faction as one of their top 4 factions. These stats are taken from Pro Rank. I've selected to show like the largest sample size that was possible, which is the top 2,500 players. I think for when it comes to Syndicate, I don't think these play rates are going to be going up the lower down you go. So I felt like this was still a pretty good indication of the faction's play rate. So we have Syndicate all the way on the right here, and we can see so far in March 2023, Syndicate has the lowest play rate. I'll only be showing the play rates. I will be covering a couple of win rates as well, just some notable ones. But the point here is just a look at the play rate, because Syndicate is consistently one of the lowest, if not the lowest played, or the least played faction. There are deviations from this, but at least looking back to October 2020, I think was the earliest point I could see. It's very consistently at the least played faction, sometimes like second least. It does have its time as the most played faction as well, but that is a strong deviation from the norm. The norm is that it's the least played or among the least played. So March so far, the least played. To the right here, we have February, still the least played. January and December of last year, it is still the least played faction. And why am I bringing this up? But it's just, I've spoken my piece about Syndicate potentially having been a mistake, simply because the game and the development team just didn't have the resources. They just couldn't afford to manage a 6th faction. But here's the thing, like if they'd introduced Syndicate, right, and it ended up being super popular, a lot of people played it, a lot of people loved it, then you could have made an argument that it was worth it, right? Like if adding Syndicate made the game more fun and more enjoyable for a large amount of players, like a significant amount of players, then you could argue that it was worth it. But like I said, the norm for Syndicate is that it's the least played faction, at least at the top 2,500 players in Pro Rank. And again, like I said, Syndicate is even less popular among newer players. So I think the lower down you go on the ranked ladder, I don't think the play rate is going to increase. I imagine, if anything, it'll go down. So moving on, we have November, October, September of 2022. It is still at the lowest. NR definitely took a shot at beating it, but it came just short, or I guess just high, of topping it. Now, on the bottom right, you will see the first instance of a win rate graph, because I just found this one really interesting. In September 2022, Syndicate, while still having the lowest play rate, it actually had the highest win rate. And I thought this was interesting. There are several cases of Syndicate having the highest win rate, or at least a significantly high win rate. But that usually comes with a higher play rate as well. So I just thought this one was a little bit interesting for no other reason than I don't really get it. Maybe you can explain. Moving on to the summer of 2022 from May to August. Here we can see in August it had the lowest play rate. Here on the top left, moving to the right. Still very low, but NR actually got below it here. And as we can see in June, NR was actually a little bit above it. And then Monsters had a small, barely higher play rate overall, but a lower play rate for players who had this as one of their top 4 factions. If you don't understand why they're judging by the top 4 factions, in Pro Rank, your rank is essentially based on your MMR decides your rank, and your MMR in Pro Rank is decided by the faction MMR for your 4 best factions. So for people who had Syndicate as one of their 4 best factions during the season of June 2022, 12.6% play rate. That's what that means. It's not super important, but I just wanted to try to clarify it. I don't know if I did it well, but whatever. That's not the point of the video. In May 2022, I really don't know what happened here. Skellige being significantly lower than in the following seasons. Maybe June introduced some new cards that Skellige rather used to climb to the top. Here, Syndicate is actually the 3rd least played faction, but you can see how close it is. Let's see. I wonder, was this when the scenarios came out? The new scenarios, maybe? Did Skellige have that high of a play rate during that? I don't know. If you want to look at some more of these statistics, they have a lot of graphs over on gwentdata.com, and it's pretty interesting if you're interested in this sort of thing. Moving on to the first quarter of 2022. Here we are seeing something a little bit interesting. April and March, fairly standard. Syndicate is the lowest in March and competing hard with Monsters here. But I'd say it's the lowest. It is slightly lower than Monsters on overall play rate. But then, January and February 2022. Here they have a fairly high play rate. Still the 3rd lowest here. The 3rd highest here in January. 3rd lowest in February. And this is actually very closely linked to this next slide, where you can see December 2021. Here on the top left, we have the play rate by faction for December 2021. And on the right, we have the win rate by faction. Here you can see Syndicate, significantly higher win rate. And very high play rate. Still only the 4th highest, despite being the significantly higher win rate faction. This was when King of Beggars was released, I believe. King of Beggars was released as a 4-power, 10 provision version of his current form. His counter was 9, not 12. So he gave you less free coins, but he came out earlier and was worth 4 points, and he only cost 10 provisions. He was an insane card. He definitely dominated the meta, and I believe it is also him that had an impact on the January and February play rates of Syndicate, because I believe their win rate was still fairly high during these 2 months, because I think King of Beggars needed a couple of nerfs before he reached his current state. And this is an interesting trend. A lot of the time, looking at these stats, a lot of the time when Syndicate does drastically increase in play rate and also win rate, it is after certain cards are added or reworked that just put the faction on the top of the meta. Here was King of Beggars. It was a very similar thing when Cleaver and Horson Jr. were introduced. The trend in the statistics was very similar. And also when Jackpot was reworked to gain that second line of text, whenever an allied unit gains coins, or excess coins, you boosted by the amount that was extra. When that rework was introduced, we saw a very similar trend. Syndicate's play rate and win rate went up significantly. And looking back to all these examples, King of Beggars, Jackpot rework, and Cleaver and Horson Jr. being introduced, I remember all these metas as being heavily Syndicate dominated and people complaining a lot about these cards. Which, you know, just goes back to what I said about Syndicate being either dominating the meta and just being a balancing nightmare for the developers, or just being non-existent. As you can see, the month before King of Beggars was released, the play rate for Syndicate was significantly lower than any other faction. I believe the win rate more or less matched it. Yes, it had a higher win rate than Monsters, but otherwise it was significantly lower than any other faction. And as we all know, Monsters have definitely had some rough patches in recent years. So it's no surprise that they are joining Syndicate at the bottom here. So yeah, that's it for the statistics. If you go and look for yourself and you scroll back further than November 2021, like, you will see more periods of Syndicate being more represented. But like I said, this is usually in line with some card drops or some reworks that lead the faction to suddenly have that edge. Syndicate is often looking for an edge, like just one or two cards they can just really abuse, really get to the top with. As soon as those cards get hit, the faction's play rate and win rate drops drastically. Another thing to point out, if you do look at some older statistics, you will also see that Syndicate, despite having consistently a very low play rate, it often does uphold a decent win rate. And that's just the thing about the faction. Like, even when it's good, even when it's definitely decent, has a positive win rate, can compete with most of the meta decks, it still holds a low play rate because that's just the nature of the faction. There are a lot of people like me who just can't get into it. Newer players can't even wrap their heads around what the faction is about, and then you have even seasoned players like myself who just never felt like getting into it, and probably never will at this point. So yeah, hope I didn't ruin your brains with my poorly explained statistics. But I'll get these graphs off the screen and you can get to see my face again. I know. Is that even an improvement? I don't know. But I'll see you back in Gwent, and we'll finish this off. Hi, we are back to a normal Gwent screen. So yeah, I hope those statistics were a little bit interesting. I hope I explained them in a decent way. It's not really the type of content I usually do, so pardon me if I didn't really know how to do it properly. But hopefully it makes sense. It made sense. Hopefully it illustrated my point. Because we're about to conclude this video right here. And a conclusion often starts with asking the original question one more time. Was Syndicate a mistake? I'm going to say, for me, and this answer probably won't shock anyone because I've been pushing it pretty hard. Yes, I personally feel the Syndicate faction being added to Gwent was a mistake. Because the game and the development team, they didn't have the resources to manage a sixth faction. They were already struggling pretty hard with just maintaining the game itself. Marketing the game has not happened a lot. Just faction identity for the existing 5 factions. Building up those archetypes. There was so much work that needed to be done in that startup phase of Gwent Homecoming. And adding a 6th faction without really having sorted out any of the underlying issues, it just, they spread themselves even thinner than they already were. And it cost the game dearly. Now, like I said at the very beginning, do I think that this has anything to do with where Gwent is headed now, with Gwentfinity and, you know, the game losing developer support and just overall, I guess, not having been a major success? No, I think we would have been headed this way regardless, but I don't think Syndicate helped. And I mean absolutely no offense to the people who play Syndicate and enjoy it, or to the people who designed Syndicate. I think you did a good job. Like, overall, I think Syndicate is a very flavorful, cool faction with a lot to appreciate. And overall, they did a good job designing it. The game did not need this. The game needed so much else, and they just added another faction with a lot of the same problems, and forevermore would have spread themselves just a little bit thinner. When I think for a lot of us watching from the outside, it's pretty clear that they were already pretty thinly spread. So yeah, I don't think the game was ready for Syndicate when we got it, but if they had waited longer, I think it would have been too late to add a 6th faction. So I think just the whole idea of a 6th faction, Syndicate or not, I think it just fundamentally was a bad idea. And it's one that definitely has costed the game. Like time and resources that it could have gone into just making the existing 5 factions better, marketing the game more. I don't know if the marketing is relevant, but you know, we all wanted Gwent to be marketed a little bit more. There are over 150 cards in Syndicate. That could have been over 30 extra cards per other faction, or less new cards, but more reworks to cards that obviously don't really have a place in the game. Like, there are still so many cards that just desperately needs attention. And maybe they could have gotten it sooner, and faster, and better, and cheaper if Syndicate hadn't been in the game. And it caused a development nightmare, seemingly. You know, seemingly, obviously, I'm not a Gwent developer. I don't know what actually happened. But it really looked like a design nightmare, or balancing nightmare to deal with for a significant amount of time. And it sucks to see. It sucks to see, and it sucks to have to blame Syndicate for this. But Syndicate, it's nothing personal. It's just, you are the 6th faction, which makes you problematic, potentially. And all of this would have maybe been worth it if the faction was seeing a lot of play and getting a lot of love and just, you know, adding a lot to the game. But it has consistently been one of the least played factions, often the least played faction, except for usually when it is broken and is dominating the meta and making people miserable. Does this also happen with other factions? Of course. But Syndicate was was the 6th one. It's the one that was added on top of the other 5 that already had these issues. So, by process of not elimination, but just a process of it is what it is. Syndicate is the one that was a mistake. I think I've said my piece. I think I got it all out there. I would love to hear your thoughts on everything I just talked about. Because this has always felt like my hottest Gwent take. Definitely the most dramatic one. Although I tried to make it less dramatic, because this is not about hate. This is not about hating the faction, hating the people who made it, hating the people who play it. Not at all. Not at all. It's just, it is what it is. As Freddy Babes would say. We do miss him, don't we? That's irrelevant. So yeah, I would really love to hear your thoughts. And honestly, if you disagree with me, then I would definitely love to hear your thoughts. Try to convince me otherwise. I would love to be proven wrong on this. I would love to change my mind. I don't think I will, because I'm a stubborn son of a bitch, but I could. But whether you agree or disagree, I would love to hear your thoughts. Syndicate is a really cool faction, but Gwent couldn't afford it. And I don't think Gwent needs it. So, I will leave it at that. Thank you for watching. If you watched this whole thing, you are a saint. I hope this wasn't a drag to get through. I felt like it went surprisingly well, so I'm gonna stay optimistic. Try to get this video out to you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting. And I hope to see you again soon for more Gwent stuff. I don't know how much I'll be playing before the expansion. I'm not super into the meta right now, but I'll keep trying. If I have a deck that I think is really fun that I'm gonna try, I will of course give it a go. But I will see you again soon, and until then, have a good one and stay safe.